Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Now today we are going to talk about latest Topping D90LE that I know some of you have been waiting impatiently. And what it's interesting about this model particularly is that this is basically Topping D90SE released 1 year ago, costing $100 more, just without MKII. So MKII hardware decoding is stripped of this deck. Well, the thing that you have to know about MKII is that that is basically a format, a compressed format used to lower the file size of your high-resolution files, high-resolution music. So we can stream that high-res music easily and use less bandwidth, but in theory preserve the most qualities as the uncompressed lossless stream would provide us. And in reality, the only service, only source of our music that's using MKII is Tidal streaming service. Nobody else. And even then, not having MKII doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot listen to high-resolution music from Tidal. Because if you're using Tidal on your PC over official Tidal app, that app can actually unfold MKII to the level of 24 bits, 96 kHz in-app using software and send that to your non-MKII DAC. So you do get high res that was compressed in form of MKII and then decompressed in software player and streamed to your DAC. The same thing goes if you're using official Tidal app on your phone. It will unfold MKII and stream up to 24 bits, 96 kHz, and it will send it unpacked to your DAC so you can listen to high-res music. The thing that you get more with a DAC that includes MKII encoding on board is a higher level of unfolding, up to 192 kHz, but you should know that not every song and every album that you're listening on Tidal is recorded in that high resolution in the first place. Because I am actually a user of Tidal. Most of the library is still CD quality. That's 16 bits and 44.1 kHz. The things that are high-res, vast majority of them is recorded on that first high-resolution level, which is 24 bits, 96 kHz, that your official Tidal software can unfold. And that highest level of 24/192 kHz is reserved for really low number of albums and songs. And even when you get it, because as I said, I'm using Tidal regularly, I have a lot of MKII DACs, it's really difficult to spot any meaningful difference between a 96 and 192. You have to own a really transparent system and you have to listen to carefully and with intent to notice any difference. But I'm talking about Tidal all the time. What if you don't use Tidal at all? When you don't have any need for MKII in that case. If you're just listening to high-resolution files from your PC, they're already in a full quality, you just play them, any DAC will play them great. If you're using some other streaming service, for example, Qobuz is a competitor to Tidal that's actually streaming high-resolution files, but it's doing it in a lossless manner. Because of that, Qobuz's streams are much more data consuming than Tidal's. You spend more bandwidth, data bandwidth, but you don't need MKII DACs. And to my ears and to ears of many of my friends, Qobuz actually sounds better than Tidal. It's not important here actually, but what is important that the only people who should care about MKII in their DACs are people that are using Tidal as their primary source of music and they're streaming it through some sort of digital streamers and third-party apps that are completely unable to unfold any level of MQA. And only those people could actually think like, having MQA is a good investment because I use Tidal a lot, I want to have access to its high-res library, but I'm not using its official app, so I cannot do that if I don't have a DAC that can do it for me. All of the other guys that are not in that position, you don't need to pay $100 more for D90 MQA when you have the exact same DAC without MQA license, and because of that, it's cheaper. Now, all of that said, let's actually move to Topping D90LE, which is D90SE without MQA. It's a classic topping DAC, so I won't bother you much about controls and looks and everything. It's built like a tank, it's really nice. If you have seen any review of topping DACs costing similarly to this, including D70s, D90, D90SE, etc., everything is basically the same on this DAC too. I'll just quickly mention that when it comes to digital connectivity, on top of these really standard ones, USB, coaxial and optical, you also get AES EBU input and I2S input. That's the one that looks like HDMI port because it is an HDMI port. It's just that the protocol that we are using to send the data is called I2S. And with that, we move to analog outputs, and here we have RCAs, that's single-ended out, and XLRs, that's balanced outputs. Both of these can be configured to work as a preamp, where you can control volume on this topping and just use it as a small preamp. It's convenient because you have a remote too. And you can of course choose to use line level output, fixed one. But the interesting thing about these outputs is that you can actually switch between two sets of voltages. One is lower, meaning 2 volts on the single-ended output and 4 volts on the balanced ones. And the higher voltage set is 2.5 volts on single-ended side and 5 volts on the balanced side of things. So which one of these should you choose and why? I'll try to make this simple for you. From my experience, higher voltage sounds punchier and more energetic, but it loses some resolution and some fine layering and detail retrieval in the process. So to cut story short, if you are using D90LE as a preamp connected directly to your power amp, in my experience, it's better to use higher voltages because that way you provide more drive and more energy to the signal, and it will sound a little bit punchier and fuller and just bigger sound than using lower voltages. But if you are using it as a DAC only connected to a real preamp, I suggest using lower voltages because they provide slightly better layering, soundstage depth, more tiny spatial cues, and more precision and resolution overall. So just try it for yourself, trust your judgment, and choose which one of these voltage levels works better paired with your own equipment, because both options have their own strengths. So let's start first with my first impression when I actually hooked it up into my system. Sound was so resolving, so full of information that I was a little bit shocked and set back. I was like, what's happening here? I cannot stress this enough. That resolution and that level of details, it's not that artificial sharpening and elevating of high frequencies So just to give you an impression of sharpness, it truly contains impressive amount of details and resolution. And you realize that when you actually start listening for its tonality. The bass line is actually full and punchy. It has a lot of weight. It has a lot of dynamics and kick. I connected it directly after using SMSL M500 MKII. That's quite full sounding DAC on its own. Okay, I'll talk about that comparison a little bit later. The point being that D90LE sounded quite full and punchy in the bass line. But that bass is so masterfully controlled that at all times I'm just thinking how well controlled it is, how textured it is, and how it starts and stops on a dime. It's just so well controlled bass line, but it does have weight and it does have punch. Again, texture in those bass notes. For example, if you're listening something like double bass, and I'll put that on the screen, something like this, you'll hear that there's energy and weight in Topping's bass line, but you'll hear so much of that string vibration and those plucks and beginnings and the ends of notes where something actually touches the string and you have that textury tone. And the exact same story goes for the mid-range. Hugely informative and filled with details with such density that's insane. For example, I'm listening to this song. It's a cover, but I really love this one because it has some sort of raw energy to it. And it sounds a little bit zesty, almost edgy. It's bordering unpleasantly grabby and out there recording, but in a pleasant way, in my opinion. And D90LE picks all of these prominent edges and string plucks and everything with such ease. And it layers everything so well, it separates everything so well. And I don't just think that layering in terms of different instruments and vocals, etc. Even one instrument, like somebody is playing a guitar, and I am more aware, listening to this Topping, that that guitar contains several different strings, of which each of these is plucked at a slightly different time and have separate line, separate tone, than I was ever aware with any other DAC reviewed here at this channel. And that same guitar has a decent amount of body and a decent amount of tone decay. I'm listening to that string going down in time slowly, and I hear the tone decay. Because of that tone decay, I hear really nice spatial cues around the instruments. Which means this Topping does not sound flat, it's not spatially flat. Some more affordable Toppings are. Some really affordable ones, like Topping E30, are really flat sounding. This one is not. It has really respectable amount of spatial cues. It has wide and decently deep soundstage, and it simply sounds tonally correct and neutral. It's not overly bright, it's not overly dark or anything. It's also dynamically very energetic, but it has that firmness and directness to its sound. At all moments, you have a feeling that Topping is holding a really firm grip over everything happening in that recording and in that song. So if you want something that actually sounds softer, mellower, a little bit looser, maybe bloated in a good way with some slight bloom and things like that, D90LE is not doing that. It's a master of control, layering, separation, and just putting out most resolving, most information-filled sound that you've probably ever heard up to $1,000 price point. And that actually leads me to comparisons. So first one that I wanted to make is with SMSL M500 MK2. That's a DAC that I've been using for the last few months. It's a 2-in-1 unit costing $440 that really impressed me. It made me give up my Denafrips Aris 2 because this SMSL sounded equally full in the vocals, but a bit more precise, narrower too in terms of sound staging, but more precise, more dynamic and more punchy. And I've kept using it. I didn't care for it costing less. So that was basically my first comparison when I inserted D90LE into the system. I've immediately noticed that D90LE resolves even more details and it packs every note with more texture, and what I mentioned earlier about strings, you're more aware that when somebody is playing guitar, that guitar has more strings. Well, of course you're aware of that because you know how guitar looks, but you actually hear it. You hear every individual string better, and it just sounds more incisive than M500 MK2. SMSL still sounds a little bit fuller and smoother in the mid-range, but D90LE basically takes everything else, including that its bass line goes lower, kicks harder when it needs to, so the bass line is actually punchier, it's more kick and slam kind of bass, but at the same time it does have more control and it does feel more detail filled, more texture filled. Mid-range offers more presence through Topping D90LE. So things like husky vocals, things like voice that's a little bit old and filled with age and whiskey and all that good stuff will sound just a little bit more present and more realistically placed in the middle of your speakers with Topping D90LE. So listening to something like Johnny Cash, for example, I love this song by the way, it will make his voice a little bit more rough and raspy, and it will infuse it with more of that type of detailing and presence. But that said, M500 MK2 is actually great on its own when it comes to vocal rendering, and in terms of just body and fullness, they're both equal. Both of these have this sort of forward-sounding sound staging, so both will project vocals quite close to you, like you're going to feel they're in your room, not something far away and a little bit more laid back, like Denafrips Aris 2 would do. So in terms of sound staging, these are pretty similar. In terms of pushing leading vocals a little bit forward, making them big and present, these two DACs are similar, but D90LE is doing that with more resolution, more clarity, slightly better separation, and by doing that you also hear a little bit more empty space around each vocal, each instrument, and increased level of spatial cues of echoes that seem a little bit smoothed out through M500 MK2. And lastly, if you actually play something really fast-paced and dynamic such as this, D90LE, because of that firm grip and control, sounds a little bit quicker and a little bit more eager to jump with rhythm. So quick, fast-paced, energetic music will sound a little bit more infused with energy and just more bzz, electric through D90LE than it will through M500 MK2. Oh yeah, I don't want to forget to mention sound staging. D90LE is actually really good at that, as good as any Delta Sigma DAC that I've heard so far. So it does produce quite decently wide sound stage and like reasonably deep. It does that a touch better than M500 MK2, but it's not at the same level as an R2R DAC would do. So for example, Denafrips Aris 2 would develop bigger, more enveloping sound stage that goes deeper, but on the other hand, Aris 2 would lose in terms of resolution, in terms of separating tones from each other. It throws more of a really big but kinda hazy sound stage. And it's also not as dynamic, as quick and as punchy as D90LE. Aris 2 is more of a big giant. It does dynamics in big swings and big motions. It can do like hoop, ho. Whereas D90LE can do that quicker and faster, and because of that, microdynamics and quick, fast-paced songs will sound more lively, more snappy, but you'll have to decide if that microdynamics, firm grip, really quick sound, punchy, kicky sound is something that you actually want, because in the right system that sounds really impressive, and personally I did prefer D90LE slightly to SMSL M500 MK2, which also means that I preferred it to Denafrips Aris 2, but you might feel differently, especially if you have maybe lean, strident sounding system and you don't need this firm hand of Topping D90LE, but instead you want something that will just make your sound nice, laid back, warm, and a little bit hazier in case of Aris 2. Now, another really great DAC at this price point would be EarMen Tradutto, and that one is really full-bodied, punchy and slammy in the bass line and mid-bass, and it does sound fuller and punchier and just more full-bodied than D90LE, but it again smooths over some details and some textures that D90LE just resolves with such ease, and it lays it bare in front of you, and it's like, here's your texture, here are your really snappy edges, and here is your electric energy with transients and just insanely fast. Tradutto is also slightly rolled off up top, so it has kinda darker, tamer sound character to it, whereas D90LE is not particularly bright by itself, but it's definitely a little bit more open than Tradutto. It has a bit more air and echoes and tone decay and things like that. Also, in terms of sound staging, Tradutto has really decent pulpability of sounds, and it has quite decent sound stage depth and layering, but in narrower space. D90LE definitely manages to spread soundstage a little bit wider, and it manages to separate tones and vocals kinda better with slightly more empty space around them. And I also know that I'll probably get a lot of questions about, please do compare D90LE with D70s. Well, unfortunately, D70s was a loan that I had to return a long time ago, but what I can tell you is that I remember D70s sounding slightly more resolving than Denafrips Aris 2. And it sounded really clean and crisp and smooth, but it didn't develop particularly deep soundstage. It was wide, detailed, clean and smooth, but again on a more flatter side when it comes to soundstage depth. I've noticed that all of these decks that I've tested after, including EarMen Tradutto and SMSL M500, those had more of a 3D feeling, more of a palpable sound that's much more similar to Denafrips Series 2 than I remember D70s having. That was more a flattish sounding Delta Sigma type of deck, precise, clean. Where this story actually leads is that when I compare D90LE to these mentioned Tradutto and M500 MKII, I feel it's almost as equally palpable and juicy sounding with vocals, and it has quite comparable soundstage depth. It's one of the deepest sounding Delta Sigma decks. And the only ones that go wider and deeper are R2R decks and chord decks, for example, chord Qtist. But I didn't have that same feeling with D70s. So I'm going to draw a conclusion out of that I think that D90LE does sound more palpable in the mid-range. It has even greater amount of details and slightly bigger, more realistic soundstage with more palpable instruments in space. Take this with a pinch of salt because I haven't compared them directly, but I can draw some conclusions from these indirect comparisons. And that would be all for today, guys. Now, to sum it up quickly, D90LE offers impressive levels of details and texture and grip and control over bassline, but it doesn't do that at the expense of dynamics and liveliness of the sound. It's actually the most punchy, most lively sounding topping that I've heard to date. Also, quite important, with the widest and deepest soundstage of all toppings that I've heard to date. Once again, did I mention how densely packed with details and transients and crisp edges it is? If you're looking for that type of sound, I think it's definitely one of the best decks on the market anywhere near this price point. But if you're looking for something mellow, romantic, bloomy, or warm, things like that, this is probably not a device for you. But if you want something that has electric energy and it's so quicky and speedy and it's etching details and pulling them out with laser focused precision, while not sounding overly bright, D90LE is definitely a force to be reckoned with. And I'm not saying that there are no better sounding decks out there, but I'm saying that this one is so good, so informative, that most of us would probably never want more from a deck. And I hope this review wasn't too long, but I had a lot of things to share, and if you like these type of in-depth sound quality reviews with lots of comparisons, then please like, comment, subscribe, consider becoming a patron, and see you next time. Bye.